Warning, the footage you are about to see involves unstable structures and forgotten underground zones. Do not attempt to explore abandoned buildings without professional experience. What we found down here was never meant to be discovered. The darkness of the Chicago basement was absolute, broken only by the frantic echoing sounds of claws tearing against solid masonry. Max, hold on.
Get away from there.
My boots slammed against the cracked concrete floor, the sound of my own heavy breathing filling the stagnant air. I swung my flashlight in a wild arc, the beam cutting through a thick curtain of decades-old dust and spiderwebs. The light finally caught him, my German Shepherd Max. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, his teeth bared in a primal, frustrated snarl. He wasn't just digging, he was obsessively clawing at a section of a massive, seemingly seamless brick wall at the far end of the abandoned factory's lowest level. This place had been sealed off since the mid-20th century, a forgotten relic of the city's industrial boom. There was supposed to be nothing down here but rust, rot, and the ghosts of old machinery. But Max knew better. His sharp barks echoed like gunshots in the confined space, a clear, urgent warning that he had found something the human eye couldn't see. Easy, buddy. Let me see. Back up, Max. Back up. I dropped to one knee, the dampness of the floor immediately soaking through my cargo pants. The air down here was thick, smelling of mildew and wet earth. But as I leaned closer to the wall where Max had been tearing at the decaying mortar, the atmosphere shifted. I brushed away a thick layer of pulverized grit with my gloved hand. The bricks looked identical to the rest of the foundation, but the mortar here was different, crumbly, almost hastily applied. Then I felt it. It started as a faint whisper against my wrist, but as I pulled away another chunk of loose mortar, it became undeniable. A sharp, freezing draft of air was whistling out from a hairline fracture between the bricks. It wasn't the stagnant, damp air of the factory. It smelled like dry rot, aged wood, and something sweeter, like dried tobacco and old leather. It was the scent of a room that had been holding its breath for 100 years. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pressed my palm flat against the cold bricks, realizing with a sudden chilling certainty that this wasn't a foundational wall. It was a barrier, a seal. I aimed the flashlight beam directly at the crack, watching the dust mote swirl violently in the escaping draft. I looked down at Max, who was now sitting perfectly still, his amber eyes locked onto the wall, letting out a low, steady rumble from deep within his chest. Easy. Max, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rush of the escaping air. Wait, do you feel that? There's a draft coming from inside the bricks. My God, this waltz isn't supposed to be here. The air hissing through that crack didn't belong in a forgotten industrial basement. It belonged to another era. As I shone my flashlight around the cavernous space, the decaying concrete pillars and rusted monolithic machines cast long, distorted shadows across the floor. We were deep beneath the streets of Chicago, a city whose foundations were practically built on secrets and rebellion. Back in the 1920s, during the height of the Prohibition Era, this city was a literal battleground. Above ground, it was all strict laws, temperance movements, and the illusion of control. But underground, it was a completely different world. It was an era of ruthless syndicates, smoke-filled speakeasies, and the intoxicating, rebellious pulse of jazz. Places exactly like this, abandoned warehouses and factory basements, were perfect covers for subterranean bars. They were hidden sanctuaries where the liquor flowed freely until the inevitable, violent police raids shut them down in the blink of an eye, forcing people to leave their entire lives behind in the dark. I looked down at Max. His hackles were still raised, his nose twitching rhythmically as he processed a complex tapestry sense I couldn't even begin to comprehend. We had been tracking through this labyrinth of rot and forgotten industry for over an hour. It hadn't been an easy trek. Spiderwebs thick as gauze had clung to my face, and the floor was a treacherous obstacle course of twisted rebar, ancient tree roots breaking through the foundation, and puddles of foul, stagnant water. Yet through it all, Max had been uncharacteristically focused, purposefully pulling me deeper into the abyss. Before we even reached this phantom wall, he had given me the first breadcrumbs. About 50 yards back, near a collapsed secondary stairwell, Max had stopped and started digging at a pile of debris. I had crouched down to see what caught his attention and pulled out a small, water-damaged matchbook from the dirt. The logo was barely legible, but the elegant lettering read 1924. Just a few feet from that, half buried in the silt, lay the jagged remains of a heavy crystal rocks glass, the kind you'd serve a stiff, expensive whiskey in, not the sort of thing you'd ever find casually dropped on a gritty factory floor. Those small anomalies had felt out of place earlier, but now, staring at this hastily constructed brick barrier, the pieces began to violently align in my mind. The mortar here wasn't laid by a professional mason. It was slapped on in a blind panic, a desperate, rushed attempt to erase whatever lay on the other side. Max let out another low, vibrating growl from deep in his chest, taking a bold step closer to the fracture. He scratched at the loose mortar again, glancing back at me with those intense amber eyes. He knew we weren't just standing in front of a structural anomaly. We were standing on the very edge of a frozen timeline, and whatever history had tried to bury down here a century ago was begging to be let out. The brickwork was impossibly thick. I drove the heavy steel end of my crowbar into the mortar, but it barely left a scratch. My flashlight flickered, the battery struggling against the damp, heavy air of the subterranean vault. A creeping sense of claustrophobia began to set in, and the sheer weight of the factory above us suddenly felt suffocating. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, ready to call it quits. "Come on, Max." I sighed, lowering the crowbar. "It's just a dead end. We're chasing ghosts." But Max wasn't having it. He refused to yield a single inch. He planted his paws firmly on the dirt, his body rigid, and let out a sharp, commanding bark that echoed violently off the concrete. He didn't just want to stay. He knew exactly where we needed to strike. Relying on his incredible instincts, Max shoved his snout aggressively toward the bottom right corner of the barricade, scratching at a single, unassuming brick sitting barely above the floor line. I knelt back down, aiming the dying beam of my flashlight where he indicated. Unlike the others, this brick was slightly recessed. The mortar around it wasn't just crumbling, it was completely hollowed out from behind. "All right, buddy. One more try." I wedged the flat edge of the crowbar into the narrow gap. I planted my boots, gripped the steel with both hands, and threw my entire body weight into it. Crack! The sound was deafening, like a gunshot in the dark. The stubborn brick gave way, plunging inward with a heavy thud. Instantly, the structural integrity of the hasty barricade failed. A massive web of fractures spidered up the wall. I grabbed Max by the collar and yanked him back just as a massive section of the brickwork collapsed outward in a suffocating cloud of gray dust. A gust of bone-chilling air rushed out to meet us. It wasn't just cold, it tasted like history. The heavy, unmistakable scent of aged bourbon, rotting mahogany, and stale tobacco hit my lungs. I clicked my flashlight to its highest setting and stepped through the jagged breach. When my beam swept across the darkness, my breathing completely stopped. This wasn't an empty storage vault. It was a time capsule. Overturned wooden tables and rusted wrought iron chairs lay scattered across a beautifully tiled floor, left exactly as they had fallen during a frantic stampede a century ago. Shards of broken glass glittered like diamonds in the dust, and there, sitting quietly in the very back of the cavernous room, was a small elevated wooden stage. We hadn't just found a hidden room. Max had led me straight into the heart of a perfectly preserved 1920s Prohibition speakeasy, a world silenced by a raid, sealed in total darkness, and waiting exactly 100 years for us to find it. The dust settled slowly in the beam of my flashlight, dancing like tiny, ghostly embers in the freezing air. I stepped carefully onto the small elevated wooden stage, the floorboards groaning under my weight as if complaining about the century-long interruption. Max followed closely behind, his earlier frantic energy entirely gone. He didn't bark, he didn't growl. Instead, he moved with a quiet reverence, sniffing the edges of the platform before stopping abruptly at the center. He let out a soft whine and nudged his nose under a loose, warped plank. I knelt beside him, my heart still pounding in my throat. I wedged my gloved fingers beneath the rotting wood and carefully pried it up. Hidden in the small cavity beneath the stage was a heavy, weathered leather instrument case. The leather was cracked and brittle, crumbling slightly as I pulled it into the light. I unclasped the oxidized brass latches, holding my breath as I opened the lid. Inside lay a tenor saxophone. The brass was heavily tarnished, green with age and neglect, but its elegant curves still held a tragic beauty. I gently lifted it, wiping away a thick layer of time from its bell and keys. But it wasn't just the instrument that caught my eye. Tucked beneath the velvet lining was a thick, leather-bound notebook. I carefully opened the brittle, yellowed pages. I had expected to find a ledger, a mob boss's list of debts, payoffs, or illegal shipments. But what I found was so much more profound. It was sheet music, page after page of meticulously handwritten musical notation, accompanied by margin notes, scratched-out lyrics, and emotional scribbles. On the inside cover, written in fading, elegant cursive, was the name Elias Vance, 1924. Elias wasn't a gangster. He was a black jazz musician, playing in the underground circuit of Chicago during a time when his skin color made it dangerous to exist, let alone shine. I gently traced the faded ink of a composition titled Midnight in the Rail Yards. These weren't covers of popular songs. They were original masterpieces. They were the raw, unfiltered soul of a man pouring his heart out in the dark. But looking around the chaotic, overturned room, the truth became painfully clear. The police raid had struck before Elias could ever share this music with the world. He had hidden his soul beneath the floorboards in a desperate panic, and he never made it back to retrieve it. The cavernous room suddenly felt incredibly still. The silence was deafening, heavy with the weight of unplayed melodies and stolen dreams. Max let out a long sigh and lay down obediently right beside me, resting his chin on his paws. In that quiet, peaceful moment, the tragedy of it all washed over me. An entire legacy, a lifetime of brilliance, had been trapped behind a brick wall for 100 years. For decades, Elias Vance had been a ghost, a silent echo of the Prohibition Era. But as I held his notebook in the dim light, feeling a profound sense of heartache and immense respect, I knew his silence was finally over. Because a German shepherd refused to walk past a cold draft, this man's music, his true voice, was finally going to be heard. I carefully wrapped Elias Vance's leather-bound notebook in a protective cloth from my backpack, treating the fragile, yellowed pages like the priceless artifacts they truly were. The saxophone, heavy with a century of tarnish and untold stories, went safely into my duffel bag. We couldn't leave them down here in the damp darkness to rot away into nothingness. Elias's soul had been trapped in this frozen, forgotten speakeasy for far too long, and it was finally time for his music to breathe. Max stood by the jagged hole in the brick wall, looking back into the shadowy time capsule one last time before giving a soft, contented huff. His job here was done. He turned and trotted toward the distant decaying stairwell, his tail giving a slow, relaxed wag. The frantic energy that had driven him to tear at the mortar was entirely gone, replaced by the calm, steady demeanor of a loyal guide who knew he had successfully completed his mission. The climb back up to the surface felt completely different than our descent. The oppressive, heavy weight of the subterranean vault seemed to lift with every step we took toward the street level. When we finally pushed open the rusted exterior door of the abandoned factory, the blinding late afternoon Chicago sun hit our faces. The crisp, modern wind rushed into my lungs, a sharp, beautiful contrast to the stale, bourbon-soaked breath of the 1920s we had just left behind. I looked down at Max, who was happily sniffing the fresh breeze, his golden and black coat catching the golden hour sunlight. Without his incredible instincts, I would have walked right past that cold draft. Without him, an extraordinary talent would have been erased from the world forever, reduced to nothing more than dust under a concrete floor. Time can bury almost anything. Buildings, people, and even the beautiful music they made in the dark. It covers up the past with dirt, silence, and forgetting. But history never truly disappears. It only waits for someone or some incredibly smart dog brave enough to uncover it. Today, a silenced melody from the roaring 20s finally found its way out of the shadows, and Elias Vance's true voice is going to be heard. What do you guys think Max uncovered today? If we can find the right historians and jazz musicians, I want to bring this original sheet music back to life and record it for all of you. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you want to hear Elias's music played once again. And if you want to follow Max and me into the next forgotten place, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, keep exploring.